Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Itchon. Tim and I are PRI Senior Director of Communications, and I chat with David White, founder of Terroirist, an award-winning wine blog. Dave joins us to discuss how the wine industry is faring during the global coronavirus pandemic. Dave shares his advice on organizing a virtual happy hour and gives recommendations for good wines that you can buy online or at the corner grocery store, as shelter-in-place orders are keeping Californians away from their favorite wineries. I think you'll enjoy this. Thanks for joining us. Welcome back to Next Round, Dave.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's really good to be here.
So you help run a public affairs firm in Washington, D.C., but you're also the founder of a wine blog, Terroirist.com, which is fantastic and actually an award-winning blog. So with all that virtual happy hour sessions happening, across the country during this COVID-19 stay-at-home order, we thought this would be the perfect time to have you back. So before we jump into the different wines, tell us a little bit about your website, Terroirist.com.
Sure. Well, believe it or not, the story of Terroirist actually begins at a PRI dinner way back in 2007. So I was out there in 2007 visiting you guys, and the next day, my colleague Robbie and I went off to Napa. We linked up with two friends and went to Napa for a quick little trip. We were at that point in our lives. We were both in our mid-20s. So there you go. That was 13 years ago. And, for the first time in our lives, we had disposable income. And of course, like all smart people with disposable income, the first thing we wanted to spend it on was eating and drinking better. So we went to Napa for a few days, and I just fell in love with wine. All four of us on the trip did, but by the time I got back, I was just head over heels. So started buying wine, started reading about wine, started reading wine blogs, much as I could to learn about wine as quickly as I could. And pretty shortly thereafter, I decided, I should start writing about wine as well. So in 2010, I decided to launch a wine blog. It was really the heyday of wine blogs. There was a lot of wine blogs time, but I noticed there was a gap in what they were covering. There wasn't really a wine blog that was comprehensive and that really looked at, the entire marketplace of wine every single day of the week, and tried to at least attempted to cover everything for everyone. So that's what I set out to do. And that's the story of the blog. And from there, I started taking wine writing pretty seriously. I had a nationally syndicated wine column for a while, wrote about wine at various times in the Washington Post, New York Times, et cetera, et cetera. But Terroirist was really my baby, and it's pretty exciting that it's now been around for 10 years.
So the wine industry, like so many other industries, is going to be impacted by the coronavirus pandemic. Although, as an aside, I don't know if they're going to be negatively hurt or positively impacted with all the wine drinking that I'm doing alone. So talk about the economic state of the industry now, worldwide, and of course, here in the U.S. and California.
Sure. It's been tough. Obviously, it's fun to focus on the media reports about how folks are drinking so much more at home. That's certainly true. That's a trend that I think a lot of folks are hopeful continues once the stay-at-home orders are lifted. But if you think about it, it's really only benefiting the retailers. Retailers are absolutely a critical component of the wine trade. We have a lot of friends in the wine retail space, and they are certainly happy right now with how things are going. Delivery orders are through the roof. They're considered an essential business just about everywhere, and folks are certainly drinking more at home. The stats are folks are drinking wine, beer, and liquor sales are up about 25%, and interestingly, volume sales are only up about 20%. So that means that people are drinking more and better while at home. I think counterintuitively that makes sense. Since people aren't drinking at restaurants, they're shifting to nicer wines and nicer cocktails at home. But again, the news is really only good for wine retailers. It isn't so good for producers, it isn't so good for importers, and it isn't so good for distributors. Now, to talk about importers and distributors for a second, remember, they were already reeling with and dealing with the tariffs that President Trump imposed on wines from France, Spain, and Germany because of the trade dispute with the European Union over Airbus and other issues. So they've already dealing with a 25% tariff, and that certainly is doing them no favors right now. And the entire industry depends on the hospitality industry. We think of restaurants and bars, but there's also hotels, there's nightclubs, there's tasting rooms, even airlines and cruise ships. All of those sales have completely vanished. Under ordinary circumstances, a domestic wine producer sells a good portion of their portfolio to restaurants and distributors around the country. And again, all those sales have disappeared. Skurnik Wines, which is one of the most prominent importers and distributors in the country, they're based in New York. About half their sales come from sales to restaurants and hotels. That's gone. gone. One of my friends at a distributor in DC, 80% of his sales come from restaurant sales. Those were all gone, vanished overnight. So sure, the component of his book that's sold to retailers is going up. That's great, but it's not making up for what we're seeing from restaurants. Same can be said for wineries themselves. Again, folks are drinking more at home, which is great long-term for interest in wine. It's great right now for retailers, but most wineries, especially the high-end ones, pay their bills by selling large quantities of wine to distributors who then get those wines into restaurants, and that's gone. So you've seen a huge shift as producers have scrambled to bolster their direct-to-consumer efforts, but it's really it's sort of like restaurants with takeout. It's keeping the lights on, and I hate to say it's keeping the lights on at best, but unless there was already a really robust direct-to-consumer component of a winery's sort of revenue stream, it's been really tough. And, in some ways, a winery doesn't want to depend entirely on direct-to-consumer sales because you can sell so much more, so much easier if you're selling to those distributors who are selling to restaurants, and that component of the business sort of overnight, the light switch was flipped off.
Dave, let's turn to California for a moment. So you know that the growers and the whole industry here has seen some pretty rough years, the long drought, the fires in Napa and Sonoma, as you mentioned, tariffs due to the trade war with China, and now the coronavirus. So give us your thoughts on California's wine industry in particular, and how do you think we're weathering this new challenge, and what's in store for the industry?
Yeah, before I get there, good point about the tariffs with the trade war with China. The impact there, to talk about the European Union tariffs, well, the Chinese tariffs impacted sort of refrigerated shipping containers. So that's having a huge impact on sort of the global wine trade because there's fewer, refrigerated shippers, or as they're called in the industry, reefers, on the ocean right now. Also having an impact on oak barrels and all these things that you wouldn't necessarily think of. So to your question about how the California industry is weathering this challenge, they're scrambling. You mentioned the wildfires, you mentioned the drought. It's an agricultural industry, so they're used to hiccups like that, as horrible as they might be. In some way, hiccups like that are to be expected. It's an agricultural industry. The season starts with bud break, the season ends with harvest. All the meanwhile, you're excited about the holiday season. Everything is cyclical. Things are expected, and because it's agriculture, you expect some seasons to be booms and some seasons to be busts. This has been really hard. This came out of nowhere. The good news for the wineries is that they're farming operations, and farming operations are considered essential businesses in California. So the wineries are still able to do the important work on the vineyards, and further, they're still able to package up and ship their wines to consumers. And just like farming is an essential business, so is shipping is an essential business. So the wineries have really shifted full focus to direct-to-consumer, and even there, they've had some logistical issues. Wineries have complained about a lack of access to delivery boxes. They've complained about a lack of access to labeling equipment. Even though they're allowed to be open, a lot of wineries who don't bottle their own wine, you've probably, if you've been to Napa, you've seen mobile bottling lines. You've seen folks bring their juice to facilities that do the bottling and do all that sort of stuff. A lot of those businesses are shut down. So there's been a lot of unexpected hiccups that they were not prepared for, just like none of us were. And the ones who are doing best are the ones who were able to shift to direct-to-consumer. What does that mean? It generally means the really small ones who weren't selling extremely expensive wine. I was talking to a friend who's the winemaker at a well-known Napa cab place that makes very expensive wines, and he said sales have essentially plummeted to zero. And he wasn't surprised because they're in the business of selling $300 per bottle Napa cab. And if you can afford $300 per bottle wine, chances are you probably had a lot of money in the stock market, and chances are you've lost quite a bit of that money over the past few months. On the other hand, those wine producers who are making, whether you want to call them esoteric wines, whether you want to call them sort of the new California trendy wines, the folks who are making the bottles that are $20 to $50 per bottle that are really popular with sort of the restaurant crowd, the folks who work at restaurants, the folks who dine out several nights a week, those producers already had pretty robust mailing lists, and it's been easier for them to shift to even more direct-to-consumer because so much of their client base are the ones who miss eating and drinking at restaurants and can afford to spend $20, $30 per bottle every night of the week. So those are the wineries that have done the best. The folks who already had good direct-to-consumer operations and the folks who really specialized in bottles that certainly a premium price point, but easier to stomach $20 on a bottle of wine than, $100 on a bottle of wine. So those are the folks who have done best.
Many state and local governments have actually temporarily lifted restrictions on restaurants selling bottles of wine and even cocktails, I've seen, for takeout, and also allowing liquor stores and wineries to deliver wine and other spirits to people's homes. So how has this helped the industry during this tough time, and should these changes be made permanent after the crisis passes?
Well, I will take your second question first, and the answer is absolutely. If you're, listening to the PRI podcast, I certainly hope you believe in freedom and freedom of choice. And freedom of choice should absolutely mean that if you're a restaurant owner, you should have every right to sell a prepackaged cocktail to allow folks to take it home with them or whatever it may be. So the easy question, should these changes be made permanent? Absolutely. So your first question, have these the lifting on these restrictions made things easier for the industry during this tough time? Sure. So is it enough to keep some revenue coming in? Absolutely. But is it enough to keep the lights on? That really remains to be seen. At least in DC, we're seeing so many restaurants scramble to turn themselves into takeout options, but they don't have staff anymore. It's the chef and maybe a sous chef and maybe the owner doing everything. They're cooking the food, they're bringing it to that one table where you're supposed to pick up your food, or maybe even they're hopping in their car and delivering it to you. If they throw a bottle of wine in as well, if they throw a cocktail in a Tupperware container in there as well, is it a little bit of revenue? Absolutely. But again, these folks are really struggling. I'm not sure if it's going to be enough. The other thing you're seeing restaurants do, and I know it's really happening in San Francisco, it's happening in DC, it's happening in New York, is restaurants are starting to clear out their cellars again in an effort to keep the lights on. But it's a catch-22. Some of the best restaurants in San Francisco, just like some of the best restaurants in New York and DC, their wine cellars have hundreds of thousands of dollars in wine in them. And right now you're seeing a lot of these restaurants mark these wines down 30, 40, 50% to try and keep revenue coming in and try to keep the lights on. But parting with that wine is a challenge because those collections took years to curate. They contributed enormously to the identity and profitability of that restaurant. So when things return to some semblance of normalcy, and who knows when that'll be, especially for restaurants, a restaurant lucky enough to reopen may find itself without the rare and pricey bottles that made them such a big deal restaurant in the first place. So it's a tough time for restaurants, and I'm not sure if as fond as I am of the lifted restrictions on taking cocktails home and buying bottles off a restaurant list, fond as I am of the lifting on those restrictions, and I certainly hope those restrictions are permanently lifted, I'm just really worried for all the restaurants in the country right now.
Despite the wine and beverage industry's challenges, they've done a lot to give back during this coronavirus pandemic. Some distilleries have switched operations to make hand sanitizers. Other wineries have provided supplies and helped raise funds. Talk about some of their efforts.
Yeah, it's been wonderful to see how distilleries, big and small, have changed their processes to help fill the shortages in hand sanitizers, as we've all used a lot more hand sanitizer than probably ever before in our entire lives. The main reason for that is that it's not a stretch to go from making bourbon or rye or rum or vodka to changing your process just a little bit, changing your ingredients just a little bit, and turning it into hand sanitizer. I'm not sure if it's 120 proof or 140 proof, but at a certain point, the alcohol you distill is sort of absolutely FDA approved to be a sanitizer. So you mix it with some glycerin to thicken it up. You mix it with some aloe to prevent people's hands from cracking, as I'm sure everyone's hands are because we're all washing our hands so much these days. So it's not that hard. It's been fun in DC. One of my favorite local distilleries, Cotton and Reed, which is a local rum distillery, they're now making hand sanitizer, and a lot of the small guys are doing that. The American Craft Spirit Association estimates that 75% of craft beer producers are now making hand sanitizer, and all the big folks are doing it as well. Pernod Ricard, which makes Absolut Vodka and Evian Tequila, they've converted all their facilities in the U.S., which is Arkansas, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Texas. They're all now making hand sanitizer, and they're working with state and local governments to make sure that hand sanitizer is widely distributed. So it's been really fun to see how this industry, most of us love and enjoy, but how quickly they were able to convert their process to something that really served the public good, and how quickly they were able to it's been fun to see how the private sector has been able to so quickly help out in a time like this.
So now for the fun stuff. You've edited a great book called The Everything Wine Book, which is a complete guide to the world of wine. So give our readers some advice on how to organize a virtual happy hour, what they should drink and how they should be drinking, and what are some of your favorites right now?
Sure. Well, a lot of my favorite wineries in California are doing virtual tastings. One that comes to mind is Mathiasen. They're a real darling of sommeliers and restaurants across the country. They're selling 6 and 12 packs of the exact same wines you'd have in their tasting room. And if you buy one, they're doing free shipping and they're happy to do a virtual Zoom tasting with you. So I know that lots of group of friends spread out across the country, the husband and wife together buy that 6-pack. They link up with a bunch of other friends who also buy that 6-pack. And then they get to do a tasting room with the winemaker, just as if they were visiting that winery in Napa together. So that's a lot of fun. I'm also seeing folks, my favorite Pinot Noir and Chardonnay producer in California is Pei. They're on the Sonoma Coast. That's P-E-A-Y. Every Friday night, they're doing a virtual tasting with their winemaker where they open a different bottle from their current release. So fortunately, I buy from them every vintage, but when they announced this, I made sure I had every single one in my cellar, and the ones that I didn't have, I bought, just so that if I have, if I'm free on a Friday night, which is every single Friday night until further notice, I can hop on and enjoy them. And it sort of gives my wife and I something fun to look forward to. What can readers do on organizing it? There's House Party, which is a really fun app. We've been doing Zoom with friends and finding some sites that have, modified versions of Cards Against Humanity and some fun games like that. So it's just been fun to sort of virtually pretend as if we're hanging out with our friends. Fortunately, it's easier, a lot easier now than it would have been 10 or 15 years ago before we had Google Hangouts and House Party and Zoom and all the rest. As for the rules, how to drink, what to drink, when to drink, I would say there are no rules. I mean, obviously, if you're going to do a formal wine tasting, it's fun if you all have the same wine. So look for opportunities like the one offered by Mathiasen. If you don't all have the same wine, there are ways to wing it. I'll open a Chardonnay, I'll open a Cabernet, I'll open a Champagne. A friend and I are doing a Champagne happy hour one night next week, and we're both getting excited about it and texting back and forth about which bottle of Champagne we're going to open in our respective houses. One of my favorite winemakers in California, a guy named Dan Petrosky, he's the winemaker at Masakan, which makes Italian-inspired white wines in Napa Valley. Every night at 5:30 p.m., he's doing what he calls quarantine, where he makes a different craft cocktail every night, sometimes multiple iterations of it to sort of figure out which vermouth works best in a particular cocktail, which orange bitter works best in a particular cocktail. So there's lots of ways to have fun virtually as we make it through this difficult time.
Dave, give us some advice on drinking alone. And Tim and I are opposite ends on this. Tim is drinking the good stuff, but I want to save mine for when social distancing is a thing of the past. Who's right, and will I be waiting for a long time?
So I have no idea if you'll be waiting for a long time, but I do know that Tim is right here. Drink them if you got them. I feel that way generally about saving a special wine for a special occasion. The old Wall Street Journal wine columnists back in the day had what they would call open that bottle night, because everyone has some special bottle of wine, whether it's a Berthier Bordeaux, whether it's a prized bottle of Dom Perignon that you got for your wedding. And for most folks, these bottles just collect dust until that special occasion, which never comes, and that's why they said it's open that bottle night. And it was always on a Tuesday. I forget what time of year it was, but the point of the holiday was this is your excuse. And how I always explain it to people is you make it a special occasion when you open that special bottle of wines. We're all doing takeout now, not going out, so we're either cooking or doing takeout. It doesn't matter if your entire agenda for the evening is to, catch up on the Ozarks on Netflix and eat some takeout Chinese food. If you really, want some champagne with your Chinese food, go for it. And if all you have in your basement is a bottle of Dom Perignon that you got for your wedding 10 years ago, there's no better time like now to open it up. So I'm in Tim's camp on that. We all need joy right now, so why wait for it?
Hear, hear. So you mentioned a little bit ago about restaurants selling their good stuff at, in some cases, bargain prices. Do you think that we'll be seeing some good prices for fine wine overall when these different wineries open up and we shift a little bit back to normal? And what are some of the great bargains you're seeing right now that you can recommend?
So right now, if you're ordering directly, there are really endless deals. I'm seeing everybody's offering free shipping right now, or shipping for a penny, or shipping is free if you buy 6 bottles or more, things along those lines. I've seen discounts of up to 50% from some wineries in Napa. So what I would say is your best bet right now looking for wine deals is twofold, especially for folks in California. Visit the websites for your favorite wineries. There's a really, really, really good chance they're already doing something that's a better price than you would have ever expected from them. The second thing I would recommend is head to a wine blog called vinography.com. It's one of the most popular wine blogs in the country. It's run by a guy named Aldo Yarrow. He has an entire post that aggregates the best keep wine alive deals. That's the hashtag on Twitter, Keep Wine Alive that all the wineries are using to promote their deals. So he's aggregated just about every deal. It grows every day, and the deals are just, they're unbelievable. The one that caught my eye today was from Red Car Winery. They're a producer in the Sonoma Coast that makes some of my favorite rosé and some of my favorite Syrah. And right now they're offering a $530 case of Syrah for $349, and they're offering a $700 mystery case of wine for $250. So these are just deals that I can't imagine you're going to see when we return to some sense of normalcy. And to your question, Tim, about whether we'll see good prices after the fact, it pains me to, I think so. And I think so because, the economy right now is really hurting. So whereas 6 weeks ago, there was certainly an appetite for really high-end Burgundy, really high-end Bordeaux. There was sort of those who were ever interested in collecting wine 3 months ago, they were collecting wine by that point because the economy had been, doing pretty well for a very long time. A lot of folks now are going to need to be selling their cellars, and every reason is probably going to be sad in some way, shape, or form. But if you're so fortunate as to have weathered this storm, I think there's going to be a lot of wine deals, and I think some of the higher end wines especially are going to come way down in price simply because they're not going to be able to command the prices they were once able to command.
So since many people can't visit their favorite wineries right now and can't venture out much, no farther than their grocery store, what are some good wines that you recommend that people can actually easily find in their corner store? And what about wines that they can order online to actually deliver to their homes?
Well, so the second question first, what about wines they can deliver to have to their homes? Let's skip the supermarket wines for a second. Again, the question for me is, how do you help American wineries that you care about? The short answer is buy their wine. Shipping is still an essential business and agriculture is still an essential business. So for most wineries in California, you can still hop online and order whatever you'd like from them and get it shipped to your door. Obviously, there are some logistical challenges. They might be delaying certain bottling because of a bottle shortage or a labeling shortage or a boxing shortage or whatever it may be. But their cellars are full and they're shipping, and they probably have some really good deals right now. And a lot of these wineries want to stay engaged with consumers, virtual tastings on Facebook, Instagram, Zoom, you name it. So please, skip supermarket wines for a second, head online, visit your favorite winery that way. But now let's go to the supermarket wines. If you're going to the supermarket, I know Tim mentioned that after this podcast finishes recording, he's headed there with his mask and gloves on. There are some widely available wines at the supermarket that I tend to love. Roederer from Anderson Valley makes probably my favorite sub $25 bottle of sparkling wine in the world. It's always a great wine, and sometimes you can find it for even less than that. I think Honig for Sauvignon Blanc is sort of the platonic ideal of what Napa Sauvignon Blanc is supposed to taste like, and Honig is widely available and pretty affordable. For Pinot Noir, obviously Pinot Noir is always a little bit too expensive for comfort, but Siduri and Flowers, widely available, delicious wines. If you're looking for something a little bit bigger, Simi and Jordan, great producers. Same for Rutherford Hill Merlot. Those are all really widely available wines, and they're just consistent and delicious year after year after year.
I have my bottle of Jordan Chardonnay chilling in my refrigerator right now for my Zoom happy hour this evening.
Wonderful. Now I want a glass of that.
Yes. So our next question really isn't a wine question, but it's more kind of, you're set up in an interesting place right now in the Washington, D.C. area. What's life like there in our nation's capital these days? Is it mostly business as usual, everybody working at home, or is it pretty much a ghost town?
It's pretty much a ghost town. In some ways, it's business as usual because of the nature of DC's business, in that lobbyists are busier than they've ever been, whether it was Tranche 1, Tranche 2, Tranche 3, or expected Tranche 4 and expected Tranche 5 of coronavirus emergency funding. I shouldn't say it's boom times because as busy as they are, I think everyone recognizes sort of how catastrophic and sad this period of time is in our nation right now. But there's certainly a lot of work to do. And fortunately, those jobs can be done at home. So I think like a lot of major cities, white-collar professionals who are fortunate enough to be able to do their jobs from home are fortunate enough to be able to do so. And in D.C., at least, there's a lot of work to do right now. But that said, it's a ghost town in a really eerie, sort of sad way. My wife and I, with our baby, live just off of U Street, which is obviously sort of it was once known as Black Broadway in the 60s. And it's always just a happening place with restaurants and bars. And it's always packed with people. And sometimes the sidewalks are so crowded that you have to walk on the street. It's crazy to see it right now. And that there's not a soul. I mean, on a Saturday night on U Street, I never would have expected that I could just walk down the middle of the street and not see a car or a soul in sight. And that's what it's like now. So it's tragic and surreal and eerie and all of those. But fortunately, my job is keeping me busy. As Rowena mentioned at the outset, I spend my days helping to run a public affairs firm, and we are very busy right now because a lot of folks have a lot of very important issues that they want to make sure they're educating the American public about. So we're doing important work, and we love the work we do, and we're fortunate that we can do it from home without missing a beat. But I certainly think that we all miss each other. We miss going to the office, and we miss going out to restaurants and all the rest.
Finally, Dave, your most recent book is called But First Champagne, which is a guide to the world's favorite champagne. For our last question, once the coronavirus pandemic is beaten and we can all celebrate, what champagnes would you recommend?
Well, to bring it back to the earlier question about when to save that bottle, we can all celebrate every day of the week right now, because if you're listening to this podcast, you're home, you're healthy, have some champagne now. When it's all beaten, what champagnes would I recommend? Well, first of all, champagne is only from the Champagne region, so this will not be recommendations about sparkling wine from other parts of the world. My favorite affordable champagne is shockingly from Costco. Kirkland brand champagne is actually produced by a legendary family in Champagne that's been making a wine, I believe, for about 500 years. The Manuel Janison family. You can get that champagne for $24.99 for the rosé, and I believe $19.99 for the Blanc de Blanc. It's really good. So certainly do recommend Costco champagne. It's unfortunate it's labeled as Kirkland brand champagne, so maybe you should serve it out of a decanter or something so folks don't know. You can play a fast one on your family members and tell them that you're bringing out the good champagne, because it certainly tastes like the expensive champagne. For a little bit more money than that, one of my favorite champagne producers in the entire world is Gimonnet. That's Gimonnet. It was actually the champagne that we served at our wedding. And you can generally find it for about $35 a bottle for their entry-level cuvee. And I've just never poured it for anyone who hasn't just been totally floored by it. Lots of other producers in sort of that price point, $35 to $48 for their entry-level champagnes. And these days, if you go to a good wine shop in a major city and say you're interested in spending under $50 and you want a grower champagne, that means the same person who grew the grapes also made the wine. There's a lot of options, and the ones that have importers and are going to be represented at a wine shop in your city are going to be pretty good. So you really can't go, just throwing darts at a sub $50 grower champagne. It's hard to go wrong these days. And if you're really splurging, if the pandemic is beaten, maybe you have the antibodies. Maybe you've already had it. You didn't know you had it. You were asymptomatic. You get the antibody test back. You're told you're immune and you can start living your life normally again. That's when it's time to bust out the expensive champagne. And for me, it's Krug. Krug has just always been, again, it's one of those wines that no matter where you are and when you open it and who you open it with, it just never fails to just totally stun and astound people who have it. So Krug is probably always my top choice for when I'm asked for that splurge champagne.
Thanks so much, Dave.
Well, thanks so much for having me on, guys. I really appreciate it.
Special thanks to Dave White and to Tim Anaya. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.